Good evening, all. I'm Dustin, also known as Rope Aficionado, and welcome to the Dominance Dialogues. This is the podcast where we explore the psychology, the sociology, and the cultural aspects of BDSM. In tonight's episode, Protocols in Practice, we bring on Hannah the Scribe. Hannah, thank you for joining us tonight. Do you mind introducing yourself and a little bit about your experience, please?
Sure. So my name is Hannah. My pronouns are she, her. I'm HannahTheScribe, wherever you can find me online. I'm a 24/7 high protocol service slave of just over 7 years. I'm the author of 11 books and a bunch of online projects, including my blog, Service Slave Secrets. I've been teaching kink education classes for about 4 years now. I run the T&G group out here in Las Vegas for young adult kinksters. I run a local writing group out here as well and just do all kinds of stuff in the community. I've been involved in my local kink scene for about 8 years now, and it's just all been pretty great.
Wow, I thought I did a lot. And you articulated that very well, and I appreciate how concisely you delivered so much information.
Thank you.
Mhm. So, where can we find you? I usually end with
I'm
that, but let's start here. Start with it. With all that you do, where can we find you?
The best place to keep up with me for just your one-stop catch-all is HannahTheScribe.com. That will take you to anything else I'm going to mention. The second best place is on FetLife, where I'm Hannah the Scribe. Like I mentioned, I do have my blog, ServiceSlaveSecrets.com, where I talk about all things protocol, service, slavery, and I teach via SlaveClass.com as well.
Wow, great. Well, I went ahead and shared your website, and we'll share it again at the end. But I'm impressed. You are very, very active, and I appreciate your service to the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, with that said, let's just get right into the meat and potatoes, right? And I'll add a disclaimer. Sometimes I add it, sometimes I don't. Are just our thoughts, just our experiences, just our opinions. There is no right or wrong answer. So, with that said, Hannah, in your own words, what are protocols and how do they function inside of BDSM relationships?
I think the protocols in the kink world are codes of conduct that are actionable and specific, and they're basically just agreed upon by the people in that dynamic. I don't believe in universals, and I think that they should be something you can act on, right? They're a do, a don't. Some people say they're usually an if then. I don't think that's true 100% of the time, but I think that's kind of a good way to start thinking about it. They're action items. And the way they function is usually, just kind of discussion or negotiation and coming up with them. I think that often coming up with them is a collaborative experience and then enforced and set ultimately by the person on the left side of the slash. I think it's on both parties to kind of remember and manage and check in on them. I think there's a lot of effort on the side of, the S type to kind of self manage and all of that, and then ultimately the enforcement comes down to the other side.
Mm. It, so I have a couple questions just on that, just for clarity. So, and
Mhm.
just to be clear, I forgot to mention it off air. When I look down, I'm taking notes. I'm not looking at my phone. And just so you know, I'm not trying to be rude.
I've got it here too.
Great. I love it. So, as you define protocols, you said they're typically work best, and these are my words, to be clear, when they're around do's and don'ts, not ifs and whens. Is that how you framed it?
I think that they can be either a do, a don't, a kind of if then situation, or a don't until. So let's say don't speak unless you're spoken to would be a don't until. And if master has less than half a cup of coffee left, get him more coffee would be an if then, right?
Mm.
So I think they can be phrased a variety of ways, but they should be relatively precise.
I appreciate that because, like, from my perspective, a lot of times I think of them as some of them are time based, right? But I really appreciated how you, once again, were very concise with your words, like if then, right? And I'm a wordsmith in my own right, and I like to get down to the core concepts of things. And I think when we look at protocols, they can get really vast, especially if we start looking at the internet. And when
Yes.
just I have a whole page of notes almost already, just based off of these few words.
I think there's really just so much to it, and then you can get into protocols as distinct from rules, as distinct from tasks. And personally, I do think I use the word as a little bit more of a catch-all as long as we're being relatively specific. To me, I would definitely say a protocol is an action, not words to live by. So the kind of like mantras or house creeds are not really protocols. Protocols, I think, are something you can kind of see or experience.
Mm. No, I once again, I really appreciate just that concise thought that protocols are action based, because off the air we talked about a little bit about mantras, I believe. And for me, they're pretty important, but it is also important. And then to this moment, I didn't really think about, I already have some separation, but there is a clear line. I like the protocols are action based.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with mantras as well, and a lot of them are kind of the I am statement versus protocols are more of a I do, I don't.
Mm, interesting. I'm already appreciating this conversation so much. So, how do you see them functioning inside of BDSM relationships?
Generally, I think they're used for kind of one of two things. The first being practicalities. I think that since a protocol can kind of be anything, or shall I say, anything could be a protocol, it can be a way to address just your own preferences and pet peeves within the dynamic and address just practical needs. And I think on the other hand, it can be, headspace enforcing, what makes someone feel that kind of exchange of the dominance and submission. And that tends to be really personal and kind of dependent on the exact role you're kind of trying to express. Versus on the practical side, there tends to be a very much, we do this because of this logistic. And on the headspace side, I think protocols tend to come from, we do this because I want to feel a certain way.
Mm. That's a really interesting thought. And I think that for me, protocols are a way for me to help manifest feeling into reality, right? Like going back to your
Mm-hmm.
words, my feelings, which I'll be honest, I struggle with sometimes. When there's action, visible things that reinforce my dynamic, that makes me feel the feels, if it makes sense, because it's a visual expression of my feelings, or it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it can definitely flow both ways. You can have the internal feelings and then act on them
Mm.
to kind of create that protocol. So you might have the internal feeling of submission and then like you're kneeling in front of them, right? Or if you're someone who's maybe a little more disconnected from those emotions, it might be the other way, that you're kneeling in front of them and then that's kind of when that feeling of submission comes.
I can definitely see that. Mm. I have too many thoughts spinning in my head on that one. But I completely agree that they're reinforcing of each other. there's been moments. So one of my protocols is if my person feels that I'm upset with them or that they are upset with me, they're to go to the humble position. For me, this is a visual representation to reinforce that dynamic, to show me that either they think I'm upset with them or they are upset with me, but there needs to be some attention brought to the relationship. For me, in my relationships, it seems that has been easier in many cases than to actually start with words. Because if I am upset with you, I'm going to go ahead and throw myself under the bus. I may not be aware of it yet. And I'll be very honest, in my opinion, I'm very rarely upset with a person. I'm usually upset with a process or a product. The person's just in my way, unfortunately. But when I see a beautiful human that is under my authority go down to the humble position, it's a reality check for me. I'm not trying to conquer this person anymore. I don't need to be upset or scream or beat on my chest. Not that I'm much of that type of character, but nonetheless, it brings me back into my dominance. Because if I am upset, I'm going to go ahead and just throw myself under every wheel of the bus here. And I am not in control of my emotions. I'm not being very dominant. And sometimes I may need my person to remind me of that.
I think that totally makes sense. I think I've always said that protocol is kind of like a love language. And it's basically developing a personal language between the people involved. So whether it's, like you were talking about positions or hand signals or exactly what language is used, it's just kind of a way of creating a language that actually works for both of you. I think creating protocols and conlanging, let's say, isn't really so different. And ultimately, especially I think for people who are neurodivergent, it can be a way of making things really clear in a way that just general body language and language sometimes isn't for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm definitely on the spectrum. And I think that actually someone just commented protocol is certainly a love language, and absolutely for me it is a love language. It's a way that I can express my love towards the people around me and a way for them to express their love towards me. I've talked about it pretty openly. My sexuality is authority, period. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thank you for some of these thoughts already. I'm very interested to see how much more are spurred. So going right into like the next question, what are some examples of everyday protocols that couples may use?
Some of my favorite protocols that we use in our dynamic are just all across the board. I think one of the biggest headspace reinforcing ones for me is I sleep on the floor, I sleep on a leash, I sleep undressed, the whole kind of image of that. And I have a specific time I go to bed, specific time I wake up, specific positions to get leashed and unleashed from. And for me, that's kind of the thing that bookends the day. So it affects how my day starts, how my day ends. And I might be unconscious for it, but it's still about a third of my day I spend there, right? So I think that's something that's huge for me. We have a lot of speech protocols, starting with, speaking only when I'm spoken to and codified responses. She gives me an order, grants or denies a permission, gives me feedback. There are certain ways I'm supposed to respond, usually being yes, mistress. I only wear my uniform. So I wear the same exact thing every day. It's something, she approved, we kind of pick out together, but ultimately she has to say on that. It's just one thing that's very visual. No matter where I go in the world, that's what I look like. And that literally becomes my self-image, like my mental picture of myself is going to be me wearing my uniform. And I think that just really gets in there into my head as well. Just we have a ton of stuff, different sleep positions in our repertoire, again, different speech protocols, and all kinds of different things I need permission to do, including really basic stuff like go to the bathroom or take a shower, things that you can't get around even when life isn't always looking super kinky.
Mm. May I ask a personal question about your feelings around protocol?
Sure.
And with that said, you're always welcome to opt out of any question I ask,
I'm an
and I
open
will
book.
take no offense. Um, how you framed your start and your end was bookends, and that spoke to my soul. I'm a bibliophile. What does it feel like to be a bookend?
Hmm. I think in terms of
Like, what do you feel like at the end of the day when you described it as a bookend, when you know at, for example, 9 p.m. I do XYZ, at 9:15 I am leashed and on the floor XYZ, right?
Mhm.
What does that feel like?
For me, it's just very comforting. As someone who is autistic, I like the structure and routines and just kind of finding the thing that works, really refining it and then kind of doing it over and over, right? And so for me, it's very, I think, comforting and soothing to have that structure. And I think it's done things like improve my sleep. A big part of sleep hygiene people talk about is do the same thing every night before bed. It's just a form of conditioning, right? And for me, it's like, okay, I'm going to have evening inspection, 9 p.m. I have a little bit of time to myself. Then I have leashing time at 10:30. It's always the same. It always kind of looks the same. I'm in the same position, and my body is kind of like, okay, it's time to go to sleep. And I think in the morning, I don't have any of that, roll over and shut the alarm and hit snooze. Like, there's none of
Mm.
that anymore. It's like we have to get up because, we have to get unleashed and we have to do our morning maintenance discipline ritual and, start the day. And so that very much like this is how it is, kind of removes that decision fatigue and just creates that kind of calming sense of structure and just kind of allows me to put things on autopilot versus having to just think my way through it and exhaust myself with that and summon that willpower. It's just like, here it is, here's the routine.
That makes sense. I think, like, for me as someone that's on the spectrum, consistency. That's what works well with me when it comes to dynamics. I've talked about it often. I don't necessarily know how to be a good boyfriend, but I can be a good master, dominant owner, left side of the slash, partly because it's clearly articulated what it does mean to that specific person and to me what a master or dominant is. And then consistency is really easy. I mean, look, tonight we tried to use a new application that I purchased for this podcast. Um, I had some technical difficulties and it was just easier for me to go back, something that I've used for a year. And I don't know about you, but I felt like my energy rising. And then when I just made the decision to go to the what I knew, that consistency, my bookend for the podcast type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
I was ready to have a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is everyone has rituals, everyone has routines. Your ritual might be that you hit snooze between 7 and 9 times every morning, but it's still a ritual, right? And we all have things we do over and over. We are all, to some extent, creatures of habit. And protocol is just about defining and refining that and living it with another person.
I think you hit on something really, really important, that we all have various routines inside of our life. some of them were just may not be conscious of.
Yeah.
I didn't think about like the snooze, the person that hits the snooze, but that's a really great example, because I can think of people that are like, oh yeah, I have to have 5 alarms set in the morning, and I'm sitting here like, well, why don't you just have one? Like, I don't understand, but the first 4 don't matter. The 5th one, they're up every time.
Right. And it's like, that's still, if you're doing it every day, and that person can sit there and tell you about it, right? So, like, they kind of know. And it
Mm-hmm.
just might not sound like, the up and atom ritual we kind of think about. When we think about rituals, we tend to think of them as being more formal, or, kind of this ideal version. But I think everyone has rituals, and really accepting that and defining them, I think, is what allows us to then optimize for what works for us.
I think like once again, I tend to throw myself under the bus because it's usually the only person I have consent to do that specific action to. And for me, I definitely tend to be a formal person, and I can actually fetishize that formality of ritual, which is fun and hot and all the good things. But sometimes personally, I found that that's not always sustainable to have it as an everyday protocol. As much as I like to put on a collared shirt that's freshly ironed or so on and so forth, sometimes there's just not the time or the opportunity. So I think I'm just going to finish that thought there. And then I'm going to offer you space. Do you have any final thoughts around that previous question or what we're speaking on?
No, I don't think anything critical.
Okay. The reason I ask is because when I said that word sustainable, it was like, boom, this is the way to go into the next question. And it was unconscious. How interesting was that? So the next question that I posed for you is, how can couples, and I don't want to limit to couples, I apologize for my wording, thruples, people of adult ages that are consenting, right? How can people create protocols that feel authentic and sustainable?
I think part of it we kind of already touched on, which is starting with codifying what you already do. I think a lot of people ask me kind of where protocols come from. And the reality isn't so much that we were sitting around like, how can we come up with more protocols to have in our relationship? It was just this very organic process of, for example, I mentioned needing permission to take a shower. And the reality of that was that when I first moved in with her, I would kind of check in with her before every time I took a shower. I'd be like, hey, I'm going to be unavailable for a minute. So if you need something from me, I want to check in now. And we also had a very bad water heater. So I was like, if you're about to take a shower, then like you should go first because I want you to have the hot water. And, there were just kind of these logistics. So every time I would kind of check in with her before I did that. And eventually it just became such, a capital T thing. We were like, oh, this is kind of a protocol. I'm basically asking you for permission to take a shower. And it would feel super weird at this point if I didn't. So that's kind of where that protocol came from, was just we were already doing it for these logistic reasons. And we were like, well, since it's already going to feel weird if we don't do that, I guess that's kind of a protocol now. And I think that's where you find the authenticity, is rather than trying to come up with protocols and then do them, it's about finding the protocols you already have. I think every relationship, vanilla or kink, has protocols in a way. We all, again, have our routines. We all kind of have the things we know our partner likes, doesn't like, those things we always do. And I think codifying that is kind of where we find the authenticity and find the things we actually care about. I think most protocols that fall apart when usually the person on the left side of the slash is like, you know what, I don't actually care whether or not you do this. So if it's something you don't care about and you're not willing to enforce, then it's not
Mm.
going to be authentic or sustainable. Versus as long as you care, and if it comes relatively naturally, then you're going to have, the willpower and the ability to sustain it. And after that, it's just finding out if there are any weird little exceptions, if you can't contact your person on the left side of the slash, or if you're on vanilla people and working those in.
I the simplicity is astounding, right? Because I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about my girl and all the various things that we just naturally do that we
Mhm.
didn't necessarily discuss. But now, a year in, a lot of it's fundamental parts of our relationship.
Yeah.
Um, and it's really, when I think about it, I think about past relationships and how I was very, in my head, intentional about how I made protocols. And I'll be honest, a lot of them were hot and sexy and all the fun stuff. They rarely were sustainable for various real world reasons.
Mhm.
Like you just brought up, you're in a vanilla setting. You may not be able to call me, you know, Scuba Steve or
Mhm.
whatever it may be, right? And I'm being playful here, but definitely we couldn't probably it would be looked a little bit differently if we referred to our partner as master or slave or various other honorifics that we use and inside of an Applebee's,
Yeah.
right? And this is something where I've actually really have been thinking a lot lately about, and actually I'd appreciate your perspective. For me, when it comes to authority, the bare minimum is sir. After
Mhm.
that, we can discuss what other honorific I will accept in your life. With that said, sometimes I still find that could be off-putting inside of a vanilla setting, right? So I've had something where I've called drop roll. And this is, we're at Christmas dinner with the in-laws or so on and so forth. And this is where too many sirs might get a little bit of an attention. Well, how do you how do you handle these types of situations?
So for us, we have a section in our contract called Without Vanilla Company Protocols. So basically, any protocol that goes under that section gets dropped if a vanilla person can see it, hear it, or basically will notice it. And so for us, that includes, the only honorific that we use, just because for us, we really aren't in vanilla situations too often. So it's not a big deal to kind of just turn it off. I know that other people have picked out like a specific term of endearment. If you call your partner honey, sweetie, babe over and over, it's not usually going to be looked at. And you might have the one that kind of replaces master. It's like always call me babe, even. And you both know, but no one else is going to know. We have a few protocols that adjust in Vanilla Company to things like hand signals. So, if we're in Vanilla Company, I might still have to go to the bathroom. And instead of having it so that I don't need permission, I can just tap on her knee 3 times, and then she'll kind of look at me and nod, and then I can go.
Hmm. I really like that because it's something very discreet and it definitely, from my perspective, wouldn't draw attention to you or your relationship.
Mhm.
Hmm. Interesting. So we've talked about how, a lot of these protocols are organic. So my next question, I actually want to make it into two parts because one is just out of sheer curiosity for me because I'm sitting here and thinking about all these organic protocols in my current dynamic. And now I'm like, well, how do I formalize them without losing the sustainability, the natural organicness to them? So my first question would be, how do we establish relationship patterns into protocols? I think is a good way to phrase it.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it takes practice to kind of go from pattern to protocol. But initially, I would say make sure you're getting to the root of the thing and you're kind of really thinking about the nuances, the who, what, when, where, why, how, right? And you're thinking about, are there times this thing doesn't happen? I think the thing that goes wrong with translating a pattern into a protocol is a pattern is usually or generally we do this thing, and then a protocol is now it's always. So you kind of have to identify those exceptions up front or find out, if it is kind of an if then, what really is the if? So, and kind of narrowing down where it applies. Like, we found that when I would walk into Mistress's office, I would always kind of stop in the doorway and wait for her to acknowledge me. And so at first we were like, oh, so like that's a thing I do when I'm coming into a space she's in. But that just because she was normally in her office. But the truth was, it really was specific to her office. And it only worked when we were in that space. And it didn't work when I was passing through the rest of the house. So we had to really narrow down. It's not about me entering the space she's in, it is her office specifically. And so narrowing down that kind of where does this apply? Because even though normally the space I was entering that she was in happened to be her office, it wasn't every space. It was just that one space. And so I think really getting into not framing the pattern as a total universal, but really starting to kind of narrow down, are there exceptions? Where does this happen? When does this happen? And making sure that we're not trying to just turn a pattern into a total absolute. We're again framing it in that really like specific, actionable way.
I really appreciate how thorough you were with that, because for me, always and nevers are hard. They're really hard because there's so many exceptions, so many exceptions, and so many exceptions you don't know of that you couldn't have fathomed. And the fluidity of life provides new exceptions, even when you think you thought of every one. Yeah, it's a lot to think about. I appreciate how you really narrowed down it's specific to her office. From my perspective, like, and all my experience, and then this last 40 minutes of conversation, it's starting to sound like it's not necessarily about the action. It's about the intent behind the action or the feeling behind the action.
Yes. I think something we hit on was when I was entering her office, it wasn't so much even that I was entering a space she was in, I was entering her space, right? Like, I mean, yes, the entire house is hers, but it's her space. And she was probably in there doing a thing that had nothing to do with me. Versus if I'm trying to pass through the kitchen and she's just, grabbing some lunch, that's a very different situation. So we had to really narrow down what it was about and my intention of, I don't want to intrude on your space, rather than I have issues walking into a room, and for us, a lot of those details changed when we did things like move, and we had to start rethinking that.
So I have a question, and maybe I connected or not, or maybe I didn't. Is it that you associated her office with workspace? Because like in my head, I would not inherently just walk into my person's workspace if they worked at Applebee's, like unannounced, walk into the back of the kitchen and say, "Hey, how you doing, Susie?" Right?
Right.
Even if I had authority over Susie, I would not just storm into her workspace without accepting responsibility of the consequences of my actions. Do you think that that may have been some of the initial or inherent reasoning why you did that?
I think it may have been partially workspace and just kind of a space I felt like she had particular sole ownership of, in terms of it was somewhere she could kind of go to be alone. You know, she's
Mm,
very introverted and I'm very much the extrovert. So I'm very much like, you know, she can stroll into my office anytime she wants, unless I'm, you know, on a call, which I give her a heads up. That's one of the protocols we have. You know, I'm like, you're welcome here because you own me and you own the space. And for us, that's how it works. But for her, I was kind of like, you know, I don't want to intrude if you're trying to be alone, if you're trying to work, if you're trying to even do something fun, but just unwind by yourself. I feel like I don't have the right to this space, I guess.
mm. I can see that. I mean, once again, like as your example, kitchen, that tends to be defined as a common space inside of a
Right.
household, whereas it's her office, it's not a shared office space, it's not a shared workspace.
And it's also, you know, if I am entering her office, I pretty much always want her attention, right? Like that's, I go in there to see her versus I might go into the kitchen to grab lunch or get a drink or refill the cat food. And it's not really about her. So one of the protocols we did develop as kind of an exception was if I was just at our old house, you could kind of pass through her office. It was in a more open space. So it was if I was passing through, then I would just keep my eyes down. And if I didn't make eye contact, then I could pass through without waiting or any of our kind of entering or exiting rituals. And at our current house, there are just a couple things in her office I might go in there for that aren't about her. That's where our household printer is and stuff like that. So we have it if I have like eyes down and I don't make eye contact, I can pass through any space she's in, but mostly the office. And the second I make eye contact, then we're engaged and kind of our, you know, entering and exiting protocols, because we do have a few round exiting as well, then kind of turn on and apply. For us, it was eye contact was the line.
I like the my note here is eye contact engagement, to be as concise as I could on that thought. And once again, I like how practical you've made it, from my perspective at least, and very clear. You know, I don't make eye contact. I'm doing this. Here you go. But as soon as like I said, eye contact engagement, I just it works so well for me. So we kind of touched on like these organic or these natural potential patterns.
Mhm.
Now I'm more interested in, you know, I'm Dustin. I have this desire to install this super hot, sexy protocol because it's just really what I want. And since I get to make the decisions,
Mhm.
here we are. What advice would you give someone on the left side that would like to introduce a new protocol that's not necessarily already a relationship pattern?
If it's not something that's already organic, then, you know, just taking it slow, noting that there will probably be exceptions and a learning curve. I know some dynamics use a kind of immunity period where it's not going to be a punishment issue if it's broken. We don't, but that's mostly because, again, we work mostly with the organic protocols. And I would say I have a lot to say on how the right side of the slash can kind of cope with those decrees. But as far as for the left side of the slash, just kind of starting to think about exceptions, really thinking about the life you already have and where this thing is going to fit, when it's going to come up, and try to kind of start anticipating, you know, again, if there are going to be exceptions where this thing is not going to be a total universal.
So you open up the door and I got to be like the Kool-Aid man and pop in. What recommendations do you offer to right-siders on coping with a new protocol that may not necessarily be what they want?
I think that in terms of it not being something you want emotionally, the thing for coping is just remembering that it is what your partner wants. And hopefully you have some kind of desire to please them. And for me, a new protocol or task that I'm really not naturally into can be a great way of really feeling the power dynamic, since if so many of our protocols and tasks and all that are natural, sometimes it's like, am I really doing this as a power dynamic thing, or is this just something we both happen to do, right? So I think sometimes those decrees can be a great opportunity to really actually, feel the influence of control and remember that you do want to please your partner. And even if it doesn't come naturally, it's still something you want to do. And after that, it's just, the logistics of remembering and all of that.
Hmm. No, wow. Thank you for your thoughts. I'm probably gonna say it a few more times. I like that you stated that, well, a few things. One, that sometimes it's a way for you to feel that differential of power, right? And that's usually
Mhm.
a big reason why we're getting in these types of a relationship, to feel that differential of power. And that's like I tried to withhold the smile from my face when you said one thing, and I don't know if I did it well because I'm not always good at masking. Um, but it was like, am I really a master, or am I just happen to be doing something enjoyable with somebody else that's really enjoying it? Because most of me and my girl, we just align in many a ways.
Yeah.
So inherently, from my perspective, that power imbalance isn't always seen. There's one example that I really, really think of that just sticks out in my head, and I imagine hers as well. If not, this is her note that it should. This summer, we were at an event, and it was a vanilla event, like a camping event, and it's late at night, 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. We're at our campsite, and, most everybody in the camp is settled in and nobody's around and so on and so forth. And she decides to rub my feet. And I'm sitting in my chair, feel like a king, and I have this beautiful human rubbing my feet. And lo and behold, there was a gentleman that walked by to go to the restroom. And he just looked over and he kind of smiled. And he says, "It took a lot of work to get where you're at." And I kind of smiled. I said, "Yes, it did." He said, "I was talking to both of you." And I was like, mm, "It did. It did." So those moments where we establish a protocol to exercise our authority, right? And I've spoke about it often. Well, maybe not often, but it seems like it over the few years. Sometimes desire to please is enough.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's not. What advice do you offer when the desire to please your authority figure isn't enough? That desire to be in service to this person? Because from my perspective, the phrase that I've put it is unconscious resistance to authority. I have seen wonderful humans that are under my authority. I know they wanted to do X, Y, and Z, but something prevented it, right? And I know the desire to listen was there, as they demonstrated it time and time and again in the past. And I think that most of that time, those hard moments are the desire to serve. I think sometimes that unconscious resistance stems from when desire isn't enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the desire to please and serve goes pretty far. Our dynamic, any issues with protocol tend to be pure accident. But I think that when you run up against at least kind of the desire to do something other than obey, it means that usually, for me at least, it's hitting on like a very deep issue. So I tend to then pay very close attention to that thing. And it's usually not just about this is this random thing my brain picked out to kind of test out that resistance to authority, because I don't have a ton of that authority resistance. It's usually this specific thing is an issue I maybe didn't realize. So it can be, it was a trigger, a button, whatever you want to call it. Something got pressed that I maybe didn't know was there, but it's definitely been pressed. And now it's time to figure out what that is and why.
Very good thoughts. I think often that sometimes we don't necessarily realize all the things like we think we do, right? Especially me as a left-sider. Yeah, I like to think I'm all-knowing sometimes. Not really, but it sounds cool. And I think sometimes we need to step back and evaluate the situation. And I think there's responsibility on both sides. So, like, if I see someone resisting when I know they necessarily wouldn't, it shouldn't be, here comes correction, you're intentionally resisting my authority. It should come potentially, if I'm in a good mood, with conversation on why are you trying to resist my authority. If I'm bad mood, you're probably going to do what I want. And then maybe tomorrow we'll talk about why I had to force you. But I also think that this, and you brought light, and I really appreciate that on more than one occasion through this conversation, you brought responsibility to yourself as a right-sider on why I don't want to resist. Why am I resisting? What button of mine was pushed? What is deeper here that we may need to discuss, or I may just need to reflect on internally? And this is where, for me personally, I think that journaling can be very, very valuable.
Yeah, I absolutely believe in journaling for everyone, really. I know we talk about, the slave journal a lot, but I think left side of the slash, right side of the slash, vanilla people, there's pretty much no one I wouldn't recommend some form of journaling to.
I know one of my coping skills when emotion starts to try to control Dustin, I'll write an angry text message to myself and I'll never send it. Whatever or if it's not even anger, whatever emotion it is, just for me to type it out raw, because that's not how I write. I normally am very like perfection, going back and editing 12 times. So for me to just like sit there and smash on my keyboard or pen to paper, it's a relief. And that's probably the best way I can say it. Like, I think you even just seen me. Like, I felt like something coming off of my chest. Like,
For us, we have what we call the raising issues form. So it's a form that either of us can fill out to communicate some kind of issue to the other person. So from my side, I use it since I'm in an irrevocable consent dynamic and I can't use like safe words or limits to kind of say, I mean business. I can use the form to be like, hey, I really, really want you to take this into consideration without having to get upset. Like just sending the form kind of means I mean business, right? And from her side, it's a way to communicate issues that might not be a punishment issue, but it's like, I didn't know this was an issue for me until right now, but you hit this button and I want you to know what happened. And maybe it'll become a protocol or something like that moving forward. But right now it's not. So we can use the form. And we've used it maybe like 4 times between us in the last 7 years. It's not a very frequent thing, but it's very nice to know it's there. And for me, something that's happened a few times is I start filling it out. And when I start filling it out, I'm usually very emotionally worked up. And like you said, there's just that catharsis of it all comes out, just very raw and just dumping it all out onto the page. And then I'm like, okay, well, I am going to send this. So I need to start editing. And after that catharsis, I feel a little bit better. I go back through and I start editing. And I kind of start reality checking. I'm like, well, what was maybe going on from her side? It's probably not that she secretly hated me this entire time. She's probably going through this. And then sometimes I reality check so hard that when I'm done, the entire document is gone. And I'm like, oh, there's actually not a problem here once I applied my inner editor, And so sometimes the form, even without being sent, has been a super valuable tool.
My note that I just took for this was edits can remove emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Because while that's not my process, I'll write it out, I'll delete it. Like I said, I usually write it to myself. I don't ever send it. Because it turns out that's usually who I get upset with. Weird. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I imagined that the reason why I just delete it is because whenever I started doing this, I don't even know, probably 20 years ago at this point, I probably did what you did. I'm guessing, I'm just guessing, that I probably started to edit it to make it actually a digestible, intelligible document. And there was nothing left when I removed emotion. And I'm only speculating here. It's really interesting to think about that. So many great thoughts tonight. I greatly appreciate them. So I think we've talked about a lot of the good stuff, so to say, if we're going to put a value to it, of protocols, how to create them, right? Now let's start talking about the other side. Most things are binaries. So in your own words and your own opinions, what are some of the challenges of maintaining protocols in everyday life?
I think for me, it boils down to a few things. One of the biggest questions I get as someone in a high protocol dynamic is literally just, how do you remember all that? And a huge part of it is, yes, we did codify things that were organic, but certain things we did, kind of have that decree or just try something out. And for me, the key trick to remembering has been just changes to my environment. So if I'm like, okay, this is my uniform, this is it, this is everything I wear, I cleared everything else out of my dresser and closet, right? So I'm not going to reach in there and grab the wrong thing. I have Post-it notes up all over the house reminding me to do or not do various things. And, it's incorporated into my productivity systems. There's just so many things that I do for the remembering side. And a lot of it, honestly, has come down to just basically different meditation practices to really bring me more into mindfulness and in the moment, body scanning, practicing protocols via visualization. And I think on the visualization note, just one of the hardest things for me at this point, as someone who has little interaction with the vanilla world and is high protocol, is turning it back off. And, it's less about, oh, we're in the dungeon, now I'm going to start calling you mistress. It's more, like you said, we're in an Applebee's, I'm going to stop calling you mistress, is actually kind of harder for us. And for me, that's where kind of visualization comes in. And I'll kind of visualize my way through a scenario before I'm in it. So I'm like, okay, we're going to, walk into the Applebee's, and then, we're going to be shown to our table, and I'm just going to sit down. Normally I need permission to sit on the furniture, and I'm not supposed to ask to do that. So normally I would just kind of be standing there. I'm like, but we're in public, so I'm just going to sit down. And I just start visualizing my way through the whole relatively familiar process of being seated at a restaurant. And I'm like, where do I need to make changes? And so then once I'm there, I kind of feel like I've already rehearsed, you know?
Mm.
And after that, it's just my own personal mental health challenges. I'm schizophrenic. So when I'm, not connected to reality, protocol is definitely a challenge. There have been times where I believe Mistress wasn't real. And that definitely is a challenge with protocol. And we also had to define whether or not those times kind of counted in terms of enforcement of protocol. Like, if I don't know who you are, if I think you're not real or that you're trying to kill me, am I still supposed to answer orders with, yes, mistress, and how does that work? And we decided that since with chronic mental illness, the line was kind of too blurry to draw. We were like, yes, it does count. Everything counts. And then we had to define, do I want to know about that infraction right away, even though it might stress me out at the moment? And I was like, yes, because otherwise I might always think I'm doing something wrong and you're just not telling me about it right now. And that thought was way more stressful than being told I'd done something wrong when I was already having a bad time. And, I tell people high protocol in general isn't a speed trap. And, so she would kind of work with me during challenging times like that. If I'm nonverbal, and the rule is that if she gives me an order, I say, yes, mistress, then she'll avoid giving me an order because she knows I can't respond appropriately. So she would say things like, why don't you come lie down over here instead of slave, go lie down over there, So I think a lot of it was just where certain lines are and how we address that.
So in your dinner analogy, in my words, you framed it how like you're in your head, you were going through like the linear process. Like, I'm gonna get my milk, I'm gonna take my first bite. It's usually of the protein, then I'm gonna take a sip of milk, then I'm gonna finish my protein, or however it may be. As someone on the spectrum, if there's not protein on my dinner plate, I don't know what to do, right? And now I'm being a little facetious here, but at the same time, I'm not, because I've talked about it often. I fixate on a process sometimes, which is great, and really bad sometimes, because, like I said, in that scenario, what do I do? So, Hannah, in that scenario, what do you do when your process is interrupted?
It's definitely hard. And that's why I try to think through so much of it in advance, because I find that if it doesn't come as a surprise, it's much easier to cope with and to be like, okay, this thing is coming. I know that for me as someone with autism, I'm very sensitive to change. And so if I can make the change just a little bit less sudden by being like, okay, this thing is going to change, and therefore it's still a change, but it's also a plan instead of a surprise, and I can start thinking my way through it, that can kind of numb the emotional impact a little bit. And ultimately, I use a lot of mindfulness and grounding practices to just stay regulated. It's like focus on your breathing. Can you feel the air, cooling when you inhale and warming when you exhale? And pick something small to just kind of be like, okay, I'm still here. I'm still in my body. I'm still okay, even though this small thing has changed. Finding something that is consistent, maybe, and trying to fixate on that instead.
I know that makes sense. At the same time, like, sometimes my brain, it's like 1, 2, 4. Oh no, 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 no. No, I'm like Sheldon Cooper here. I gotta go back. We're starting over. Like, and until I find that 3, my brain's gonna hurt probably.
Yeah, no, I feel that. When I was first in the process of getting diagnosed with autism, we were also exploring OCD because I kind of had the obsession factor for sure, right? And then the kind of compulsion was ultimately where it fell apart for me. But a lot of my obsessions were kind of actionable, and it was things like, if I don't get dressed in the right order, then I'm just like not sure I actually got dressed, you know? I'm like, if I didn't put on this and then this and then this, I'm like, did I actually put on this? And then I just have to start over. And for me, that's something that protocol can really help by codifying those processes and, you know, enabling them to be conscious and optimized. Whereas where some of those obsessions were falling apart was when things did change. It's like, well, now I no longer wear Y, and therefore from getting from X to Z is super stressful because there is no Y anymore, and I can't act on that obsession.
Mm.
So I think codifying things with protocol helped me in the sense of giving me a place to actually refer to. So for me, writing those routines down and then just going through that list, like I can literally check these things off, brought me that kind of peace of, yes, I did check everything off, rather than having to be like, I missed Y, I've got to start over completely. And also, there is no Y, so that's not going to work.
Yeah, it goes back to those always and those nevers. There's
Hmm.
never a time where it's always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yep.
Right. Even in math, as much as I love math, there are times where things change, and I don't want to get lost in a math lesson. But nonetheless, I think that for me, something that has been very monumental in putting into my life and my dynamics is being fluid and adaptable. It took hiking the Sierra Nevada mountains in 27 days and 90,000 foot of elevation to teach me that lesson.
Hmm.
Because I went out there with 3 plans. I knew everywhere I was going to camp, what elevation I was going to camp at, how far water was, everything. For 27 days, I knew everything. The
Hmm.
first day I set out on the trail, the day before I met a guy, he told me about some hot springs that were off of my plan, but early I needed to go see him. So my first day changed everything. And after that, none of my plan mattered anymore because I hiked, I don't know, 27 or 28 miles out of my way to go to some hot springs.
Hmm.
That was never part of the plan. And arguably one of the best moments I had on the trail. So thank you, to the trail gods.
Yeah, no, I think sometimes we have to learn certain things the hard way, and it'll come with blessings. Like, you know, you saw the amazing hot springs. And I think those blessings are when we open up to be more adaptable, because we're like, oh, well, look what that brought me. Something maybe better than the comfort of the routine.
Mm. Yeah, there's something that I just wrote down because that's actually an idea from earlier, but part of this conversation brought it up, and like it was fate. Like in my head, I almost like, oh, it was fate that I met this guy and he was supposed to help me teach this lesson. And I was listening to Chris Williamson, and I don't remember who his guest was, and he was like, I'm working out. I'm not really paying attention, to be honest. And then it was like, Dustin, listen right now. When you claim fate as responsibility for your destiny, you're no longer responsible for yourself, right? Did this person come into my life? Sure, but I was responsible for putting myself there. I was responsible for making the decisions of making the changes to my plan, and so on and so forth. It wasn't by chance, it was by choice. So before I get like completely lost in my stories on the Sierras, because I will, this is like the perfect segue into what are some ways that we retire or adjust a protocol that may just not be working, or maybe the desire for it is no longer there, specifically from the left side, since they get to make the decision on that.
I mean, I think just the important thing is to remember there's no shame in changing or deleting a protocol. I think a lot of people have this the more protocols, the better philosophy in certain ways. And it's like, but if it's not working, we need to be able to let that go. And if we won't let go of protocols that aren't working, then how do we know the ones we still have are the ones that are working? And I think, just clear communication, basically, and doing the whole, it's not necessarily anyone's fault, just I'm not into this thing anymore. It's just not logistically practical. And then, making sure that I think sometimes protocols can be a little bit of a Jenga tower. So making sure that when we take that block out, everything else is still standing and that it's not, you know, impacting any other protocols or it wasn't kind of stacked on anything else that's now going to topple over. Because I know sometimes a lot of protocols stack into, more extended rituals or routines. So just making sure that it's not toppling anything else. And that if it was something that wasn't working, but it's kind of like something in this slot needed to work, like we needed to address this thing in some way, and this just isn't the way, then making sure we're addressing it differently. Versus if it was something we just kind of shoehorned in there and it's not working, it may be easier to just remove it.
So here's a tough question for you as a right-sider. How do you handle or how do you process is probably the better way to say it, the removal or retirement of a protocol that you still want?
It's hard. I think that the important thing is connecting again with my ultimate desire is to serve and please the person I'm with and not to be this image of submission that lives in my head. And remembering that I'm trying to serve a real person and they have their own real wants and needs and things they're not into. And remembering that that's what I'm serving, not my own mental picture, and that me projecting a mental picture of what submission looks like onto the dynamic is actually really not submissive. So trying to remember that ultimately, if they're not into it, I do want it to be removed. And that, it's not necessarily that I did something wrong with it, it's just not working out. And again, trying to kind of remove shame from that equation and not feeling like, I don't get this protocol because I did something wrong. Like it's not a punishment, it's just something that's not working or they're not into. And if it's something that, was really headspace reinforcing for me, it may be about finding something else. For me, I think that replacing protocols is much easier than retiring them. But so if it's something that really helped my headspace in a specific way or at a specific time, maybe we can replace it with something that does work for both of us. And if not, remembering that eventually we will probably develop more that will, even if we don't have ideas right now, or if it's not going to be exactly like that. Our protocol is always kind of shifting and evolving, and this is just one rung on the ladder.
I fully support and agree with the replacement over retirement. And this, honestly, I don't know if I've ever actually applied it to my dynamics. And I accept responsibility for not doing that in the past because I actually am intelligent enough to know that when it comes to habits, if you try to make a bad habit, you'll have a much more likelihood of success if you replace it with a good habit.
Mm-hmm.
Whoops. Dang, after 20 years, you would have thought I would have known all this.
Habits are much easier to replace than to remove. And when you want to add good ones, you want to stack them onto something you already do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And whenever I talk about habits, I always bring up this book. And you may have read it. And if you haven't, I would encourage you to, if you have the time and the desire, Atomic Habits by James Clear.
I
And
love Atomic
honestly,
Habits.
what's that?
I love Atomic Habits. It's a great book.
It is, and when I think about it, and I think about a lot of this conversation, a lot of his philosophies or principles, for lack of better terminology, kind of paralleled with some of our discussions, starting
Hmm.
small and building and
Yep.
consistency and so on and so forth. But anybody that hasn't read it, it's probably that and Four Agreements would by what is it, Don Ruiz is probably my two top recommended books outside of the kink community. With that said, um, do you have any final thoughts when it comes to retiring or adjusting? Well, you talked about retiring. What about adjusting? I don't know if I actually caught anything really specific to adjusting a protocol.
I mean, if a protocol needs to be adjusted, it can be, in a way, kind of being replaced. It can also just be adding in exceptions as we find them. So sometimes it is things like going from, is this any space versus just the office? Or
Mm,
does this not apply when vanilla people are around? And what are we going to, do then? Or does it need to be turned into a hand signal or something appropriate like that? So just finding exceptions and adding those in, um, and making sure that we're addressing issues instead of just trying to retire protocols every time we run into an issue. I think that, if a protocol isn't working, sometimes it actually just needs to be a little more specific. It needs to be narrowed down a little rather than, the core of it isn't actually working. It's again about being the right amount of specific. And, if it's something, if it is kind of an if then statement, maybe the if is something that comes up organically, but the then doesn't quite work. Like back in the day, we had a protocol. We tried it out that if I left the room, I was going to come and give Mistress a kiss before I did. Seems sweet, seems simple. What could go wrong? It was horrible. It was honestly horrible. It was just from day one, she was like, well, I dismissed you, so I kind of want you to leave, not to get up in my face, right? She's like, I'm doing something. Half the time this applied for some reason. At the time she was cooking. So she's like, I don't want you getting between me and my keyboard, me and the hot stove. Like, I dismissed you. Leave. And half the time I'd already have kind of moved towards the doorway. And now I have to re-enter and do the whole thing. And we were like, that's not working. And eventually that evolved into the protocol we have now, which is still the same. I'm trying to leave, but it's, I ask permission. Then I ask if there's anything else I can do to be of service. And then once she dismisses me, I curtsy and I leave. And curtsy ultimately was kind of the physical component that worked out because I don't need to touch her. I can do it wherever I am in the room, and then I can leave. And for us, again, that was kind of the same if, and then changing that then, rather than being like, well, I guess we're just not going to address that, if that makes sense.
no, it makes complete sense. And like, from my perspective, like, and just my words, like you offering your person a kiss was a way of you showing affection. And also, like, for me, it was like the stamp, the end, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
was the physical representation of this is the end of this interaction type of a thing. And when you went ahead and you replaced it with the curtsy, you still have that physical representation of, from once again, from my perspective, of you offering affection to your person in a manner that's conducive to both of your relationships and all the various ways of you might have to leave them, where like you said, you might not be right there where you could touch them necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. So I want to go back a little bit. We had a question in the audience, and I seen it, and then I didn't get to it, but it was around the mental health discussions that we were talking about and the neurodivergency. And their question was, do you feel that protocols have helped with your neurodivergency and vice versa?
Oh, absolutely. I think they've helped a lot. Like I was saying, being able to kind of codify the rituals and routines that bring the comfort on the kind of autism side has let them be something I can be more aware of, and then again kind of optimize and make my partner aware of, and for both of us. And then it's just more tools we have to kind of work with our brands of neurodivergence, because I think that in any relationship we talk about setting boundaries and communicating around our mental health. And I think protocol just gives us kind of another tool to do that with, whether it's creating a form rather than more unstructured communication where something might get lost, or again, like you were saying, codifying kind of body language for people who might not be able to read the more natural form of it. I think it's just a very valuable tool to really create something custom that works for everyone and their quirks, whatever they may be.
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, for me, it helps me not even just be a good Dustin, but a good dominant, right? And it's really helped me professionally and personally to have protocols and consistencies in my life. Like, I'm about to move the podcast area in after next episode because I have a 2-week break, and I'm so stressed about it because I'm so used to, okay, it's 8:30. I walk out to my studio, which is a separate building from my house, and then I do this, and then I do this, and
Mhm.
now it's like, what am I gonna do? Well, part of it is to expand and get better, right? And while I appreciate that change of growth, at the same
Mhm.
time, the change in consistency is some of the things that sometimes concerns me, right? Like I said,
Yeah.
I'm very clear. I know how, and it's funny, you said earlier, I think you were talking about like referencing um close, was that like if you don't do A, B, and C, then you forget if you did B and you got to start over. And
Mhm.
I've drove down the road and drove a mile back to my house because I didn't do A, B, and C, and I wasn't sure if I did something. So because I wasn't sure if I did B, then I probably didn't lock my door
Yeah.
because I didn't do B, and locking the door happens after B, right?
Yep, I totally get that.
So I don't know. I always like to try to offer like the polarities of things. I think that we see polarities in life often. The one thing that I've been, I'll say, aware of over the last couple years is, while I recognize that authority-based relationships, protocols, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, it does benefit Dustin and helps encourage Dustin become a better Dustin and a dominant. I
Mhm.
also wonder, for lack of better terminology, how much of it is a crutch, right? How much of it is it not Dustin making the conscious, responsible daily choice, but it's just Dustin being consistent, and that's just, it just works, kind of a thing, right?
Mhm.
And and that's where, for me personally, stagnation is toxic. Like I
Yeah.
cannot stay stagnant.
I think it can be really hard to balance that constantly wanting to grow and evolve, but also never wanting to change.
Hmm.
And I think for me, being very perfectionistic on the flip side has kind of allowed me to change, grow, and evolve, because I'm like, well, this is a change. I need to move in the right direction, but also change is scary, right? And so I think that something we can do is even create a process for change. For me,
Mm.
I in addition to power exchange elements, I also use a self-contract system as well that kind of functions within our ownership contracts, but addresses, kind of my life holistically. And when I make a change to it, I write up what I call a change addendum. And I write up what the date is, what I want to change, why I'm changing it. And for me, that helps me realize that there are reasons I'm making this change. And just having that little process I go through gives me that feeling of consistency, even while I'm changing, if that kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And that's like one of the notes that I just took because, like, I don't know if you meant to call me out, but that's how it was perceived. And it was a good, to be clear, but it was like how it must be very conflicting on how to constantly want to grow, but at the same time, constantly want to change. And I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, man, she knows me so well. Like, how? And I'm sitting here thinking, but my life, I've been consistently changing. And I think that if I really, one of my mantras is when in doubt, zoom out. That I really need to zoom out and look at my trajectory. My trajectory has always been like this. So as much as
Mhm.
I'm nervous about the changes that are coming with the podcast, the new systems we're implementing, the new spaces that we're going to use, that's what Dustin does. This is the start of a new year. It's time to do better than what I did last year. I'm consistent. I got 2 weeks. Well, I've already started my reflection on this year, personally and
Mhm.
professionally. And now I'm going to do what I consistently do. I'm going to implement change. I think that for me, something that's going to be really good for me that I just got out of this conversation is I need to have that process of change and how it looks like. All right. So on days that Dustin's about to change the podcast, he's going to start with a warm shower because I like warm showers. They relax me. Right.
Mhm.
And to make some kind of linear path for that change to be just part of my consistency.
Yeah, I think the saying change is the only constant can be very true, especially for people with the growth mindset. But I find a lot of people with the growth mindset still have that fear of change. And so it's kind of how can we make change feel like a constant and frame it as, we're constantly changing for the better rather than change seeming random and we're not really sure why or which direction we're going. I think just approaching it in that intentional way and trying to do what we can to mitigate that fear while also allowing ourselves to move in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the key.
Yeah. I think sometimes for me it's scary just because it's in the moment, right? And this
Mhm.
is where like one of my core mantras you've already heard me say is when in doubt, zoom out. Like there's
Mhm.
so many times that I've had to say that to me. Like when I was hiking the Sierras or various other things in life, it's like zoom out. Really, like this is 27 days of your life or one interview, a couple hours. This is a blip, right? And this can be a
Mhm.
monumental blip, right? It can change and be life altering, but at the end of the day, it's just a moment. And while I want
Mhm.
to show that moment the respect it deserves, something I've realized is for me personally, I have yet to meet a moment that was as life altering as I thought it was going to be in that moment, right? Like,
Mhm.
so to be a little bit facetious, like, oh my God, I got a flat tire. My world is going to end because I'm going to lose my job.
Mhm.
I probably didn't even lose my job because my boss is reasonable. I took a picture and I showed him I got a flat tire. I'm a good worker. But in that moment, in that emotional state, when Dustin is not in control, then, you know, the worst is coming, for sure.
And I think that goes both directions. I think there are also moments in my life that I had that I didn't really think anything of. And in hindsight, they were monumental. So trying to remember that in the moment we are such poor judges of what's going to be monumental or not. And for me, things like annual reviews, zooming out, it's like, what did I do this year? Oh, wow, I did a lot this year, even though I feel like I didn't do anything today, so I didn't do anything this year. Well, that's not true. So zooming out with those kind of highlight reel summaries, I enjoy graphs personally, so I'll make imprecise graphs of just how certain things were going, and then I could kind of layer them and see how things connect. And I can also see, hey, this graph is moving up. There was, a lot of like squiggly line going on, but it's going up. And, over the course of several years, something that felt, like this huge low plateau in the graph actually wasn't that long. And I think that, again, that zoom out is definitely the way to go.
I have two quotes that I want to bring into this conversation. Both of them come from Chris Williamson's podcast. I am a Chris Williamson fanboy. Modern Wisdom is his podcast. The one is, you've already achieved what you said would make you happy. And that goes where you just said it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I've achieved so many things, and that when it happened, I didn't appreciate it for what it was. Or even if I did, then still, like, when I look back at those moments, I was like, wow, that was a life-changing moment. That was a very impactful moment of life. And then going back to your graph, I have a feeling you're going to like this one. Trajectory matters more than position.
Yep.
And like right now, I'm a crypto person, and I've been watching the crypto go do this. But when I zoom out, and I invested in crypto in 2008, I got a J curve going on, right? It's not even a steady trajectory. And there was moments in my investment journey where I lost an annual salary conservatively. And I was like, that's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I wouldn't have had the money to lose if I didn't make the money. But then once again, zooming out, it still was that trajectory that my portfolio has constantly grown. That one day of position of being low didn't really matter. Now tying back into like more personal, I there's a couple more tires left on that bus that I haven't found yet. I've dealt with some mental health issues this year. And honestly, I'm gonna go ahead and give credit to my girl, because she didn't call me out, right? And I think that's just me perceiving it that way, right? But she brought some insight to me. And there was a moment where I was down, and I felt that people didn't appreciate me. And that's the most concise way I could say it. And a couple days later, I was talking about how many people appreciated me and all the things that people do for me because I do for them and all these things. And she was polite enough. I don't remember how she framed it, but she kind of said, wait a second, like, we're on both sides of the spectrum here. And in those moments of being down, it sometimes it's really hard to see out of that valley, to see where you're going or where you've been. Right. And I think it's important to offer ourselves some compassion in these moments. I think that personally, I think most people will deal with some mental health issues at some point in their life. I'm leaving me some big gaps here, right? But like I said, offer ourselves some compassion It's rarely as bad as we think it is going to be, and it's rarely life ending. I mean, there's obviously some things that are life ending, but nonetheless, it's rarely the case.
Yeah, it's very important to, I think, cultivate to the extent we can the ability to see past, those peaks and valleys. Because when we're down, it seems like we've always been down. And when we're up, it seems like we've always been up. And sometimes I'll go back through my journal, and one day I'm like, everything is amazing. Everything has always been amazing. Everything is always going to be amazing. And the next day, I'm like, everything is terrible. Everything has always been terrible, and everything's always going to be terrible. And I'm looking back at how rapid fire that can kind of happen, inside my head. And I was putting it down on paper. And I'm just like, oh, so that feeling of the way it is now is the way it's always been, is just, that's not even the way it was yesterday, let alone last week, last month, or this whole year. So I think that seeing that over and over again, now I think when I get into those peaks and valleys, I have a lot more, tendency to be like, this is not the way it's always been. This is not the way it's always going to be. Change is constant. And, for better or worse, something else is coming. And I think when I'm down, that brings me comfort. When I'm up, I think it brings me humility. And it reminds me how small our perspective can be. I think sometimes we're realistically looking at our life through this very tiny window that we can kind of move around. And so we can look at the good, we can look at the bad, but we can only, I feel like, sometimes process so much at a time. And our job is to try to kind of expand that window and take in more so we can zoom out and, maintain a little bit more stability for ourselves.
Oh man, that was great. It reminds me of a thought that's not mine, and my concise way of sharing this person's thought, and I'll offer them the ownership of said thought. The goddess Indigo. In one of the conversations that we had, the thought was, your perspective changes with position. Right? And like you said, when you're at the top, it's easy to look down on everything. And when you're at the bottom, it's really easy to look up at everything. And going back to the analogy of the Sierras, there's many a times where when I'm climbing like Mount Forester, it's 13,000 foot. There's times where I'm going up, and then I go down in a little valley, and then I go up, and then I go down in a little valley. And whenever I go in those valleys, I never seen how high I climbed. And all I could see was how much higher that I had to climb. Right? And like I said, it taught me so much about that. My perspective changed with my position and going. I love using the Sierras as an analogy because my position changed so much. Almost every other day I was climbing a different mountain. I was almost in a different, it like some days I felt like I was in like Star Trek or just different worlds, it seems like, because if I was on Death Valley, I might be 110 degrees desert type of stuff. If I'm up in the mountains on top of the Sierras, in August, it was 40 degrees and there was still snow on the caps. So that whole position versus perspective, I don't know if I've ever actually publicly or even personally offered the goddess as the appreciation for that thoughts, but there was a good amount of time that I thought about that thought, that my perspective is going to change with my position, that while I'm low right now, in 8 more hours, 12 more miles, I'll be at the top again, at least until tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that, you talked about receiving help from a partner on that. I think our dynamics can be a really valuable place to have another person point out to us, yesterday you were on top of the world, what happened, and really kind of have that sounding board.
Yeah, no, there's an interesting Harvard study. I believe it's Harvard, don't quote me. It's one of the Ivy League schools, if I'm not mistaken. And it's, I'll say, arguably one of the longest running research studies. And
Mhm.
it started somewhere around the Great Depression. And they took, and this is just me guessing at some of these numbers, around like 100 people from Harvard and around 100 people from non-Harvard, we'll call it. I don't remember exactly what the demography was. And the
Mhm.
goal, in my words, was to find out the key defining factor for long life. So after 100+ years, because there's still, at least last time I checked, there's still a couple people left alive inside of this research group or this group or whatever you want to call it.
Mhm.
And based off of my interpretation of the data, the single most determinant factor for you to live above the age of 80 is to have a loved one.
Mhm.
That doesn't necessarily mean, someone that you're in love with and having sex with or whatever intimate relationships, but a loved one, a good friend that holds you accountable. And that's why I was bringing that into this conversation,
Mhm.
because I'll tell you what, if nobody's watching me, how do I know that I'm doing so good?
Yeah.
If nobody says, "Hey, Dustin, you made a mistake here," they don't know that I made a mistake. And mistakes aren't inherently bad, in my opinion. There's another one of my mantras, and one of my newest mantras. There's no failures, there's only feedback,
Mhm.
right? Hmm. But
I think
we
that other
are,
people are definitely what grounds us.
mhm. Well, absolutely. I mean, am I a master without a slave? In my opinion, yes. I think that I started my journey as a master well before I took on the responsibility of a slave.
Mhm.
With that said, I'm a better master when I have a slave. I'm a better Dustin. I'm a better human when I have a slave.
Mhm.
So, I had one more question I wanted to get to. So, we'll try to be concise with it outside of my standard ask question at the end of the for resources. But my last question I really wanted to get to is, how can partners keep protocols meaningful over time?
I think that the key is recognizing that once a protocol has been in place for a long time, it can be easy to lose a sense of meaning. And that doesn't necessarily mean something went wrong. It just means time has passed. I have what I like to refer to as new protocol energy, just like new relationship energy or NRE. There's kind of the honeymoon period with a new protocol where, because it's new and it's different, it really pushes us outside of our norm and it stands out to us a lot. And it's very headspace reinforcing because we're paying a lot of attention to it and putting all of that effort in. And once it becomes a little bit more automatic and all the shininess has worn off and it's just kind of normal, it is going to lose a tiny bit of the impact. And I think the first thing to accept is that that's going to happen and that's okay. And then down the line, it's just about kind of reconnecting with how we felt at the beginning, just like we would do if we're past the honeymoon period, but wanting to reconnect with our partner. It's about thinking, how did I feel at the beginning? Why did we choose this protocol? Why did we build it this way? Sometimes I like to journal about protocols down the line. I think that's, been very impactful for me. We already talked about journaling. We've talked about change. Sometimes it is okay to mix up a protocol a little bit, just like, you might mix up something in a relationship just to kind of bring some of that novelty back. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean something wasn't working. It's just, to keep things meaningful and alive,
Mhm.
and to make sure that, we really are checking in on it and we're not just letting it, fall by the wayside, making sure that it is in fact still working and it is still being enforced. I think that sometimes the thing that can make something meaningful again is the absence makes the heart grow fonder. If something does go wrong with it one time, how do we feel? So sometimes if I do have an issue with some small, protocol or service task, then we immediately have to deal with that. It's this kind of, oh, it is still being noticed and enforced. It is still important. And I'm not saying you should purposefully cause problems to, get that feeling back. But sometimes I think just the thought experiment, even of how would I feel if this thing was absent, can be powerful in itself.
Mm. The being noticed, I think that's, from my perspective, I think that's a lot of what people desires, to be seen, truly seen.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think of Boondock Saints, and there's a quote in there. It's like, we're like 7-Eleven. We may not be always doing business, but we're always open, right? And that's what I think about for me when it comes to noticing.
Mm-hmm.
And something I didn't dive into earlier, and I'm not going to now because I respect for time and energy. But you brought up, and I'd have to go back to my notes and remember exactly how you said it, but like, do you want it now, or do you want to always wonder if it was, type of a thing? Like, do you want, if you're in a bad space, would you rather be talked about right now, like if there was something bad that happened, or would you rather worry about when that bad conversation is kind of coming? And for me, it's very much, I want to be in that here and now, and I want to address it right this moment. And I think that I'm stumbling on my thought here. Like the quote, for me, sometimes I have found that I don't always have time to address it. I don't always have time to do the business, right? Because I'm pretty distracted. And this is where I have a rule in my life for Dustin, and it extends everybody around me, at least with consent, the 24, 48-hour rule. And that eventually changed into the 1 3-day rule, because 48 hours wasn't enough. And essentially it was 1 day to talk about the problem, 3 days to solve the problem. After 3 days, it's not a problem anymore, right? Because I'm going to throw myself under that last wheel of the bus that I noticed when you didn't get my coffee correctly. I noticed the last 32 times you didn't get my coffee correctly. But I was too lost in my email to pay you the attention that needed to be given. And because of that, you've caused this offense 32 times, but now, there's 32 things to correct. That's toxic, in my opinion. That is very, very, that was toxic for me and the people around me. Because I didn't realize that those 32 times were on my back. Yep. And it was brought into my relationship, these 31 coffees. I didn't even know what the heck they were, but there was some external thing controlling my relationship, and I didn't consent to it, and I'm supposed to be the one in control. So I had to make this rule that I had to get these coffees off my back. Now you got 3. If I don't address it in 3, then you know what? I'm going to cut off my nose and I'm going to spite my face, and now that's how I want my coffee. That's the new protocol.
No, I definitely get that, where it's like, again, if that you're not willing to enforce it, then it's just not going to work. And if you let someone do something 30 times a certain way, then that's going to become a very strong habit. Yep. So that's why we really need to communicate as soon as possible.
Absolutely. One of the things, reminiscing of the olden days, Flag and Soul Hunter would talk about often is don't ever deliver an empty threat. Don't ever
Mhm.
say that I'll take your collar if you're not prepared to take that collar.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, once, in my opinion and my personal experience, once is all it takes to start the poison that erodes authority. Consistency, in my opinion, is key to most of this.
Yeah, I think consistency is really what protocol aims to kind of codify and create. It's what are we going to be consistent about and how.
Mm, absolutely. All right. Now we're approaching the 2 hour mark. So my last official question for you is what advice or resources would you give to someone that's looking to learn more about this topic?
For me, personally, my best advice is just learn as much as you can because there's so much. Learn all of the hard skills you can, put them into practice, try things out. Because if you're looking for, protocol, well, protocol could address anything. If you're looking for power exchange, well, that's going to be pretty pervasive. There's so much out there. Explore, learn, go to classes. That's all you can really do. As far as resources, I do have a recommended resources post on service slave secrets that I will point people to. But I also tell people a ton of the resources on there are not specific to the kink world. I'm very, very encouraging of finding resources from the vanilla world as well. You recommended 2 books from the vanilla world. There's a ton of homemaking and professional service resources that I recommend. And I tell people don't get stuck in the trap of thinking the only things that will help you in a power exchange dynamic are power exchange resources. Look for professional service industry, look for business relationships, look for communication skills and psychology and philosophy in general. Hard skills are hard skills. They're going to translate. If you learn to cook from a vanilla resource, you're still able to use that as a service in a dynamic. So I told people learn everything you can and don't get stuck on the exact frame of the resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And just to be clear, I went ahead and shared your website, Service Slave Secrets, that I personally have learned more outside of the BDSM community than I have inside. Now, with that said,
Mhm.
I'm not learning flogging outside of the BDSM community, to be clear. But that is, in my opinion, a small facet of what we do. That's 10%. 90% is the cerebral part, the psychological and sociological, cultural aspects, right? Kind of like what the show is supposed to be about. Um, and that's where I encourage people to, on my side, look at leadership books, read some Brian Tracy, George Maxwell, right? Um, Patrick Bet-David is a great video resource. Another great resource, actually, that I just recently got turned on to about a year ago was Toastmasters International. Their motto
Mhm.
is where leaders are born. Now
Mhm.
I'm the vice president of membership. So I can't speak enough for Toastmasters. Obviously it's well outside of the BDSM community, but if I want to be a left sider, I want to be a leader because that's my flavor of this is leader follower. I probably can learn from one of the largest groups where their motto is where leaders are born. Right?
Right. And I think even on the more hard skills, like Mistress is big into rope, and she learned a lot of what she knows about rope from books about sailing,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where a lot
Ashley
of
Book
these
Nuts.
knots were born. And vlogging, I mean, learning about anatomy from medical texts is still going to be relevant, right? Even if it's not everything. You know, it might not tell you about how to rig a person or how to, you know, use what you learn from the anatomy textbook to flog a person, but all of those pieces are still going to let you develop your own kind of style rather than just learning from within the kink world. You'll get to be, I think, more creative and integrate more parts into it.
I know I completely agree with that. I was actually I think the term is remastered the audio from a previous episode as I'm playing with this new software. And it was the interrogation episode with Sir Guy. And he was talking about various movies that he's drawn for inspiration for various interrogation techniques. And, you know, from my perspective, we don't want to pigeonhole ourselves and limit our knowledge base to the kink community, like going to your anatomy, right? While I know there's medical professionals inside of the community, they're more than likely not the medical professional to speak on medically flogging, because as far as I know, like nobody really knows that, right? Or they might be a psychiatric nurse and they're not going to have any idea on where you can hit somebody with a flogger, right? But nonetheless, if you know, in the BDSM community, you're like, okay, it's okay to hit generally on the upper back, but not on the lower back. Well, then if you go take a couple anatomy classes and see where vital organs, you can, well, the kidneys are pretty close to surface level on the lower back, and we don't want to hit kidneys. I mean, I don't want to hit kidneys.
There's exceptions always, but, you know, the whole idea is still going to be in how our bodies work, and you can learn about that in a variety of ways.
Well, and I'm going to steal Flag's words. A submissive's tongue is good for 3 things, and the third is a shovel. If you give them the time and the space, they'll dig themselves a grave. And ultimately, conveying information, and this is a service to me as my person's voice, right? There's no way I can predict everything. And like, I'm a rope person, if you're not aware. One of the most common ties in rope, at least in most iconic, well, depending, is a terracotta, a TK. Goes up over your upper arm and your lower arm, and it's arguably also one of the most riskiest. Partly because it's one of the most tied. It's actually not the most riskiest, in my opinion. It's just a numbers thing. It's the most tied. But with that said, I can think of this specific person. They defied everything I knew about rope and anatomy and everything. And I never would have known if they said, sir, I prefer my rope up a little bit higher. Now, with that said, this person was a very active person. They were very muscular. They, you know, a little bit different than a feminine body that I was typically tying. Their anatomy was slightly different. And if they wouldn't have given me information, I wouldn't have known how to properly use them.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, I have a feeling I can talk to you all night. I want to wrap this up. So now's the official time for shameless plugs. You said you got 11 books. What's your most recent book? Do you got a new book coming out? What classes are you teaching? I've already posted your websites in the chat. It's in the show notes as well. But where else can we find you? I'm sure somebody's interested.
Well, the best place to keep up with me, like I said, is HannahTheScribe.com or HannahTheScribe on FetLife. I have a BDSM based fiction series called the I'll Give You series, which you'll be able to find from my Hannah the Scribe site. I write vanilla fiction as well. I write BDSM nonfiction via Service Slave Secrets, which has been published into volumes 1 and 2. I also have a largely currently inactive blog called the schizophreniadiaries.com, which was published into the Schizophrenia Diaries, the book. and various parts of basically both fiction series and those nonfiction. I teach all kinds of different things, protocol, service. Those will all be available on slaveclass.com. And I think those are kind of the big public things for me. And my wife is also a BDSM toy maker and vendor. She sells through whipsandwood.com.
Oh, I happen to like whips and wood. I might have to go and see what you guys have available.
Yes, there's definitely some fun stuff.
Well, Hannah, I cannot say how much I appreciate this conversation. It has been thought-provoking. As someone that has fetishized and implemented protocols in his own personal relationship now for almost 20 years, it makes me almost feel old. I feel like I'm gonna have to start over on some things. I think that you offered perspective that I don't know if I would have got, because, well, for many reasons, but you offered a right side perspective, and I was more receptive due to the platform, I think, if I'm just being very transparent. So I really appreciate you encouraging some of these thought processes, and I'm really excited to see how these thoughts manifest inside of my life, inside of my personal relationships. So thank you.
I had a great time.
So we will get this wrapped up. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Dominance Dialogues. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, be sure to subscribe and share. And as always, stay curious, stay intentional, and keep the dialogue going. Until next time, let's see.